Hi guys, Brook Potter here coming to you live from Trinidad and Tobago. In this video, I will be addressing the top 5 objections that I've received concerning my ministry presentation on 1 John 1:9 and its context and audience relevance. Now, if you haven't seen these videos, I will put links to them in this description and in this video so that you could watch those videos before watching this one so you may better understand some of the objections and my responses to them. Now, upon first viewing my material, the usual first objection that I receive from Christians tends to be one of disbelief. Basically, they say something along the lines of, I just can't understand how there are passages in the New Testament that are not speaking to Christians. Or something like, I just can't imagine that in this passage John is not writing to Christians. Or something of the combination of something like that. This is something known as the fallacy of incredulity. Or what's known as the lack of imagination fallacy. It implies that somehow just because we cannot fathom something or just because we cannot understand something, therefore the conclusions drawn from it are obviously false. Now that premise just doesn't follow. Just because I don't understand the laws of aerodynamics doesn't mean that, an airplane will never use them to fly. Or just because I don't understand the laws of gravity and how they interact with everyday objects doesn't mean that, there is no such thing as gravity. Now, while that's a legitimate expression of shock for somebody to hear these things for the first time, and it may challenge their beliefs, and they may find it difficult to believe, the argument from incredulity is not an authentic argument. It doesn't in any way diminish the audience relevance or the context of the passages in question. And while I respect people who may have a different belief or may have trouble understanding it, this in no way detracts from the argument that I believe I've presented in these videos. Now, the second argument that I'm usually confronted with is Christians jumping up and immediately quoting to me 2 Timothy 3:16. And that is the passage that talks about all scripture is good for doctrine, reproof, correction, and these other things. Now, I fully believe in this statement as it applies to the entire counsel of Scripture. I totally believe that the Bible is inspired and it's good for doctrine, reproof, and these other things. But that no way allows us to be lazy in our exegesis and our interpretation of individual passages. By no means does that give us allowance to throw out such things as audience relevance or cultural context and these other things and give us an excuse just to read everything literally for us. This kind of thing usually comes from people who have a hard time believing that not everything written in the Bible is speaking to us. As I've said in other videos, there are passages of the Bible that are speaking to the nation of Israel living under the Old Covenant before the cross. Similarly, there are passages in the New Testament that are speaking to Gentile believers of the first century. And similarly, there are passages in the New Testament speaking to Jewish believers of the first century. And it is our job to use the Bible to interpret itself and understand the culture and the context to try and figure out what now is relevant to us living 2,000 years or more after the events recorded. This is what's known as the whole to the part fallacy. It's basically taking what's true for the entire Bible and trying to apply that to an individual scripture. It would be the same as me saying that because moss always grows on the north side of a tree, I can now pick up a twig off the ground that's no longer connected to the tree, look and see where the moss is growing, and thereby find geographical north. I think we could understand the problems that would come up with that type of interpretation. So while I understand it as an emotional reaction, it in no way diminishes the context and the audience relevance arguments that I have presented in these videos. Now, the third objection that I normally get confronted with is this idea that at the time when the Apostle John penned the epistle of 1 John, there were no Gnostics operating in the church at that time. Now, this is a little bit of a straw man argument because what they really mean to say is that there were no Christian Gnostics operating in the church at the time. And while that is a valid point, that was never my argument. I never made the point that the Gnostics that John was referring to were Christian Gnostics. As we know, Christian Gnosticism came into power late in the first century and well into the second century. I made the point that John was writing to unbelieving Jewish Gnostics in the first century. And I don't believe anybody's going to argue with me that, Jewish Gnosticism predates Christian Gnosticism by hundreds of years. So again, while I understand the objection and it has a bit of truth to it, it in no way diminishes the argument that I presented concerning the audience relevance of these passages. The fourth objection that I'm usually confronted with basically goes like this. My interpretation of these passages is wrong because the Apostle John is in fact writing one continuous letter without the verse numbers and the chapter numbers that we see in the Bible. Because it is one continuous letter, we therefore have permission to take the characteristics and the language spoken to in chapter 2 and apply that automatically to the audience of chapter 1. Now, this is a complete red herring. In fact, anybody who's espousing this type of interpretation is desperately trying to get the verses in chapter 1 to fit in with their ideology. So much so that they have invented an entirely new method of interpreting scripture, and I will explain that further in a moment. The first problem with this argument is that it assumes that just because the Apostle John is writing one letter, it logically concludes that it must be to one audience. And of course, there's nothing in the text to suggest that, and neither is there anything else in the New Testament letters to suggest that must be the case either. We see the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Rome. We see that there are portions written to the Gentile believers at the church at Rome, just as there are portions written to the Jewish believers in the church of Rome. The best example of this is Romans chapter 7, where Paul makes the analogy saying that what he's about to write is relevant to those who are familiar with the law, therefore singling out the Jewish Christians at the Church of Rome who were familiar with the law. This would not necessarily apply to the Gentiles. So again, this logic that a single letter must have one particular audience is simply fallacious. It's an assumption based completely on speculation. The second problem with this method of interpretation is that it completely reworks how we interpret and understand scripture. In fact, it reworks how we basically read a letter to begin with. Anybody who's ever gotten a letter knows that whom it's addressed to is at the top, and the letter is basically read from the top down. People who espouse this objection, though, are suggesting that we should read the letter from the bottom up, which of course is unprecedented. To illustrate that point, I actually have a letter right here written from my grandmother to myself and to my sister when I was 12 and that she was 22. The first paragraph of this letter is addressed to me, and it pertains to my school uniform, the importance of having a good study schedule, and the importance of doing well on my exams. The second paragraph is in fact addressed to my sister, and it pertains to issues pertaining to her car, a matter about the mechanic, and an issue about the insurance for the car and these other things. People who espouse this particular objection are basically saying that we can take the issues pertaining to the car, the insurance, and the mechanic and apply that to the audience in the first paragraph, which was me, a 12-year-old boy who never owned a car at that time. And I think we can clearly see the obvious problems that would arise with this method of interpretation. So again, people who espouse this are desperately trying to make these passages fit their ideology and are not honestly reading the passages for what they say. In fact, I would suggest that you avoid people who use this method of interpretation because there is no precedent for this kind of understanding in the understanding of Scripture. We simply need to look at the language used by the Apostle John in chapter 1 versus the Apostle John in chapter 2. In chapter 1, the Apostle John is talking about getting ready to declare something to the audience of chapter 1. He does not say he's coming to remind them or remind them of things they've heard before or reinforce something that was said already. From the context, it sounds like he's getting ready to tell them something for the first time. We contrast that with the language used by the Apostle Paul in chapter 2, where in this case he is actually reminding them of things they had heard before. It doesn't take a genius to understand that these two audiences appear, based on the scriptural context, to be different. And none of these arguments and these fancy new inventions of interpretation do I feel are legitimate ways of debunking the interpretation that I have laid forth in my videos. Now, the fifth and final objection that I normally get comes from people who basically espouse that in 1 John chapter 1 verses 6 to 10, it appears that the Apostle John is including himself in the audience that he's writing to with the use of the word we in many of the scriptures that he's espousing. Now, this is a generalization fallacy. It is akin to basically saying if I made the statement, we should not murder people, that does not automatically put me in the camp of people who murder people. It's just a generalization statement. And we just need to look at the passages in question to see whether these actually apply to the Apostle John or not. Take 1 John 1:6, which says, if we claim to have fellowship with him, but we walk in darkness, we lie and the truth is not in us. Now, even though the word we is used by the Apostle John, is anybody ready to claim that that actually is applying to the Apostle John? That he is not actually walking in truth and that he's walking in darkness? No, of course not. But again, this is a generalized statement to make a criteria to separate the believers from the unbelievers. His use of the word we is no way an implication to suggest that he's roping the believers into this distinction. Now, with that said, I have absolutely no problem if somebody comes to a different understanding about these scriptures. I'm simply sharing how I understand these passages in their context. I'm not saying that I'm right, it's just what I understand. So I hope I've managed to clear up some of the confusion and maybe put to rest some of these arguments. And please be sure to share this video if people are also dealing with some of these arguments and might want to hear a perspective on some of these things. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more. And I just again like to thank you for watching this video. Okay, God bless. Bye-bye.